weaknesses, but let's also mention institutional strengths. And one of these strengths is certainly the emerging independence of the central bank. So the type of monetary policy pursued by the central bank has been expansionary in nature, mimicking to a large extent the policy choices of the European Central Bank. The policy interest rate set by the Central Bank of Albania has been steadily reduced in recent years. And at the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was as low as 1%. So again, this very much follows a monetary policy, accommodative stance pursued by the European Central Bank. Okay, the links don't seem to work. And even so, inflation remains quite low at about 1.8% in 2019. And repeatedly year after year, the inflation rate has undershot the 3% policy target set by the central bank. So in a way, the market's responses to the central bank's policy inputs have also been very similar to the market responses observed in the Eurozone in response to the policy inputs of the European Central Bank. Another important achievement when it comes to monetary policy is the substantial reduction in the stock of non-performing loans, which in the aftermath of the Euro debt crisis used to be quite high. In fact, it was the highest in the Western Balkan region, with a total stock of NPLs amounting to over 20% of GDP. Now that's been brought down to 8%. So another substantial achievement under the leadership of the Central Bank of Albania. I'm going to move on to the second achievement. And what I want to emphasize here is the GDP growth performance recorded by Albania in the last 10 plus years, which has been certainly positive, albeit it's fair to say less than spectacular. I mean, the sort of growth performance of Albania is nothing close to that of countries like China, for instance. But nevertheless, there has been positive growth through the 2000s. And in fact, it used to be very high in the early 2000s, although it was already on a declining trend as the economy was kind of losing steam for a number of reasons that I will maybe touch on later on in the talk. The Albanian economy was also able to weather very, very well the Euro debt crisis. Well, first the financial crisis and then the Euro debt crisis of 10-11. GDP growth never went into negative territory, although it declined substantially. And then starting in 2013, the recovery started. But from then on, GDP growth has kind of leveled off at a much lower level compared to the level recorded in the early to mid 2000s. And for instance, between 2015 and 19, the average annual GDP growth rate was 3.3%. The drop that you see for 2019 is obviously the effect of the earthquake that hit central Albania in November 2019. But what I want to emphasize is that this positive growth performance has been of a particular kind, namely a kind that has been able to actually create jobs for the majority of the population in Albania. And again, this is not something to be given for granted in the context of an emerging economies. There's loads of examples of what is sometimes called in the development economics literature jobless growth. And you just have to go to Kosovo, which has experienced also positive growth rates in recent years. And in fact, in the post-crisis years, the GDP growth rate in Kosovo has been slightly higher than in Albania. But the growth model of Kosovo is such that this macro dynamism often fails to create jobs, and unemployment rates, especially youth unemployment rates, remain very, very high. In Albania, by contrast, the rate of employment creation on a year-by-year basis has outpaced the dynamism of the macro economy. So this dynamism, so the macro dynamism has actually generated lots of new jobs, so much so that the rate of unemployment is actually quite low by regional standards. And in fact, if we compare Albania to the other Western Balkan 6, it's consistently recorded one of the lowest unemployment rates in the region. And this is, I will say a little bit more about this later, but this has to do with a particular growth model of Albania, and in particular, its specialization in labor-intensive economic activities. Another important point to make, I think, is that there is a relatively high rate of female labor force participation, certainly compared to the region. In fact, it's consistently had the highest, Albania has consistently recorded the highest rate of female labor force participation in the region. Next, and this is my third sort of success story that I want to highlight to you, what I want to suggest is that this economic dynamism recorded in the last decade plus has not only led to job creation, but also to substantial progress on the front of poverty reduction. And it's very, very difficult to measure poverty. We could use the sort of standard poverty headcount ratio measure if we'd like, but I thought that it would be more telling to examine these figures produced by UNDP Albania, which give us an estimate of the share of resident households in Albania with indoor access to running water, access to an indoor toilet, and access to 24/7 electricity. Yeah, so these are all kind of measures of non-monetary poverty as measured by access to basic services. So on all these scores, Albania has made massive improvements. So take, for instance, indoor access to running water in 2002 was as low as 50%. Only 50% of resident households had access to a water tap in their home, and this is now up to 78%. Same with electricity, which used to be a huge problem in 2002. Only 14% of resident households had access to 24/7 uninterrupted electricity supply. Now, in 2012, that's up to 68%, and so it's conceivably much higher than this by now. So I think what these figures suggest is that there has been really, really massive progress on the front of poverty reduction. And again, this is not something that should be given for granted. There's plenty of examples of emerging economies that grow very dynamically, especially if they're endowed with abundant natural resources like Albania is. And yet, even though the macroeconomy is very dynamic, GDP growth rates look very high, yet the standards of living of the population tend to improve only sluggishly. Yeah, so there's lots of examples of countries like this, but Albania has kind of defied this trend, and growth has been accompanied by substantial poverty reduction. Another important driver of poverty reduction has been out-migration, and there's a lot of evidence in the literature that suggests that remittances, for instance, has been particularly important at increasing consumption, especially in rural areas, where households with family members working abroad, for instance, tend to use remittances to move out of crop production and establish non-farm businesses, with a consequent improvements in family income. So out-migration has been an important driver of poverty reduction, both directly through these channels, but also indirectly, essentially by relieving pressures on the Albanian economy by absorbing surplus labor and hence relieving pressure on the Albanian economy. On the other hand, there is very limited evidence that suggests that social policy has played an important role in poverty reduction. So the case of Albania is not like a case such as Brazil, for instance, where through the 2000s, poverty reduction was to a large extent driven by a cash transfer, so a social policy poverty relief program implemented by the government. On the other hand, in Albania, the premier poverty relief mechanism, Dihma Ekonomike, has been shown to be very, very poorly targeted at the poor, excuse the pun. So in other words, lots of non-poor people get access to the program, and lots of poor people fail to gain access to this program. So the program is very poorly targeted, the evidence indicates, maybe because of various forms of clientelism or favoritism that play out at the local level. But under the same heading of poverty reduction and social indicators, another success story that I want to emphasize is the substantial increase in access to education. So the quite impressive accumulation of human capital that Albania has achieved in recent years. So the school enrollment rate, so the share of the relevant age, so the share of the population of relevant school age that was actually enrolled at school, increased really spectacularly, especially when it comes to tertiary education. So in 2000, about 15% of the Albanian resident population of university age was actually enrolled at university. In 2014, the corresponding figure was about 65%. Yeah. So obviously this came in the wake of the increase in supply of education goods, the increase in the number of private education providers in the country that started in the mid-2000s. Obviously there's ongoing concerns about the quality of the education system, especially the higher education system, but there's also encouraging developments in that direction. Starting in 2013, the government, the administration took steps to weed out many of these questionable education providers. So the sector is now much more consolidated, and even sort of not considering quality considerations, the achievements in terms of sort of quantitative access is already quite impressive in its own right. And what's more important is that Albania now has a tertiary school enrollment rate, which is actually higher than the level observed in countries at a similar level of development than Albania. So if you take countries that have a similar income per capita, Tunisia, Lebanon, Peru, but you can go on with the list, all of them have a substantially lower tertiary school enrollment rate. So this speaks to the potential for catch-up growth. You know, so there's a lot of evidence in the literature that suggests that human capital is a fundamental driver of economic growth. Albania now has a level of human capital accumulation which is comparable to that recorded in countries that are richer than Albania. So that speaks to the potential for convergence in terms of income and growth rates to the income and growth rates of those countries. So I've tried to focus on these three positives, these three achievements of the Albanian economy: macro stability, growth that created jobs, and poverty reduction. But there are also obviously negatives. There are ongoing challenges, and I'm going to mention three of these challenges. So they don't come in any order of importance. In fact, probably I regard the second one as the most important out of the three. But the first point that I want to make is that Albania continues to face large and persistent external imbalances. And in particular, it succeeded in running a very large current account deficit in excess of 6% of GDP, in fact, for the best part of the last 20 years. I mean, and this is in a way quite a feat, because usually what happens to countries that continue to run at a deficit is that at some point they hit a wall, so to speak. There's a sudden stoppage, and they're forced to abruptly and often violently close all outstanding current account deficits, typically by depreciating their currencies or doing domestic devaluation by cutting wages, for instance. And this has massive ramifications throughout the economy because it tends to lead to bankruptcies and also so a sudden cut in the standards of living of the population, which can create social unrest. Take the case of neighboring Greece, for instance. It's remarkable that Albania, despite the large and persistent external imbalances that it has accumulated over the past 20 years, it hasn't yet experienced something like Greece has experienced. But let me show you some numbers. So this is the Albanian balance of payments for the years 2015-2019. So the current account deficit has been on average, so the annual current account deficit has been on average equivalent to about 7.7% of GDP, or about $1 billion US. And weighing down on this current account deficit was essentially a deficit in trade. So imports vastly exceeding the volume of exports. So the stuff that Albania produces and sells to the global economy is not enough to pay for the import bill. So how does Albania finance this gaping current account deficit of this trade deficit of $2 billion US, partly by means of aid and remittances, which cover almost half of the trade deficit. So this is the money that aid donors and migrants pay into the country. The other half of the trade deficit is financed by means of a surplus on the capital account, so essentially FDI inflows, so foreign investors bringing money into the country to establish businesses. And increasingly, it's financed by means of a surplus on the financial account, so which corresponds essentially to foreign loans. So let me zoom in on this, because I think it's a very rarely discussed aspect of the Albanian economy, which actually points out a very, very critical weakness of the Albanian economy. So this chart gives you the total stock of external debt as a percentage of GDP. So this is the total amount of debt owed by Albanian households and firms to non-resident entities, to foreigners. Yeah. And as you can see, this stock of debt has simply ballooned starting around the mid-2000s, which is also around about the same time when several banks were privatized and some important Eurozone banks moved into the country and started lending and deposit-taking operations in Albania. So this is obviously a critical weakness of the Albanian economy, because these debts have to be paid back. So either they are restructured, or Albania will have to essentially improve its export competitiveness in order to close the trade deficit and use export revenues to rebalance its balance of payments, so to speak. So this takes me to the second challenge or second weakness, the sort of second negative of the Albanian economy that I want to present to you today. And this has to do with the fact that there has been arguably very limited structural change in the Albanian productive economy. Yeah? So the stuff that Albanian companies produce has not changed, has not improved enough over the past decade or so. Now, let me say as a qualification that this is not to say that there has been no structural change at all since the transition. Yeah? I'm not saying that. In fact, the post-communist transition was accompanied by a massive reallocation of economic resources, capital and labor, from the traditional socialist state sectors, industry, and especially agriculture, to the urban service economy. So actually the early years of the transition set into motion massive economic changes and dislocations. But what I'm saying is that in recent years, there has been very limited evidence of upgrading in the productive economy, or little evidence of what I would like to call developmental structural change. Yeah. So changes in what Albania, in what the Albanian economy produces that actually lead to the production of higher value added products. And in fact, what we can see is that there is a continuing reliance on low skill, labor intensive, light manufacturing and natural resource exports. So to illustrate this, I think it's very telling to compare Albania to Romania. Yeah. So what I'm going to show you here is a diagram that summarizes the export mix. So the type of products that these two countries exported in year 2000 and then in 2018. Yeah. So I'm comparing how the export mix of these two countries changed over the course of 18 years. So as you can see, back in year 2000, the Romanian and Albanian export economies were actually very, very similar. So Albania and Romania had a very similar export mix. The products that these two economies were capable of producing and selling to the global economy were roughly the same. Yeah, so light manufacturing, so textiles and leather and footwear, for instance, which is included in this export category, base metals and minerals, and agriculture. So very, very similar export profile, and accordingly, the income per capita of these two countries was not particularly different back in 2000. But let's see what happened in 2000 by 2018. Well, by 2018, Romania had dramatically upgraded its export capabilities and changed dramatically the stuff that it produced for the international economy. So it's essentially changed its comparative advantage. It developed new comparative advantages in producing car parts, machinery, and electronics, largely on the back of foreign investment, obviously. So this may be a limitation, if you'd like, but still the end result was that the productive structure of the economy, and consequently the export mix, was substantially upgraded. In Albania, not the case at all. So the export mix in 2018 is substantively indistinguishable to that of year 2000. So essentially Albania is producing and exporting the same old stuff, which is low value added and not very dynamic. So accordingly, the income per capita level between Albania and Romania
I think that was me. Sorry, Luca.
Yeah, no worries. I think I was unmuted for a second. So what I wanted to say is that the levels of income per capita between Albania and Romania have substantially diverged over the years as Romania upgraded its export capabilities. Obviously, this is just an illustrative case, and in no way am I trying to suggest or to prove conclusively that the reason why Romania has done so much better than Albania is single-handedly because of its ability to upgrade and diversify its export mix. But I think the kind of the correlation or the juxtaposition of these two facts is quite telling. So let me just say something about three important sectors of the Albanian economy that I think further illustrate this point that I want to make about structural change. So the most important export sector and one of the largest private sector employers in Albania is the textile and leather industry, sometimes referred to in Albania as the fason sector. Why is it called fason, which in English kind of roughly translates as ready-made? It's called like that because these are firms that operate on a known equipment cut, make, and trim model. Yeah, so this is how it's referred to in the industry. So essentially, how does it work? So these are small, typically domestically owned firms that receive raw materials, that receive all the inputs from the foreign contractor, do all the processing in Albania, and usually the raw materials consist of things like cloth, yarn, buttons, and so on. All the assembly, so the cutting, the sewing, the packaging is done in Albania. So these are very sort of low value added activities that are performed in Albania, and then the final product is re-exported. And these companies have very limited control over input procurement, very limited control over the production process, because they also receive instructions from the foreign contractor. And sometimes they don't even own the capital goods, so the sewing machines and so on and so forth. The workforce is highly feminized in this sector, and working conditions are actually very, very poor. And recent reports have compared these industries to sweatshops. I personally like to use the kind of Mexican term maquiladora, also to highlight the striking analogies between the Albanian textile industry and the Mexican textile industry. So I don't think this is an industry that Albania should take as as a launching pad for development. The second point that I want to make has to do with the call center industry, which is another important service sector industry. And again, this highlights these sort of limited structural change that has been taking place in the Albanian economy. So what are these call centers? These are essentially companies, some of them foreign owned, that provide data entry and telemarketing services for various foreign markets, the largest of which is the Italian foreign market. And obviously, one of the only reasons why this industry has survived for so long in Albania is that the main market for these products, Italy, is a country that is fairly under-digitalized for being an advanced economy. So there is still a market, there is still a commercial viability for these firms offering data entry and telemarketing services. But with a broader global shift to digital services, and with the pandemic accelerating the process of digitalization, including in countries such as Italy, it's uncertain the extent to which this industry will be able to continue to operate in the future. And I think it would be wise for industry leaders and for the government to start thinking about either an exit strategy or a potential strategy of restructuring and consolidation for this industry. Another interesting case is the mining industry. So as most of you probably know, Albania is very rich in copper and chrome. In fact, it's one of the top 10 chromium ore producers in the world. But it's interesting that all the chrome ore that Albania produces is exported unprocessed. So even though there are 2 ferrochrome smelters in the country, one in Burel, the other one in Elbasan, they're owned by Albchrome, which is the largest mining firm in Albania. And I think there is huge potential here to further upgrade this sector of the economy by industrializing the mineral and by retaining in the country more of the value addition process that takes place along the supply chain. So essentially, instead of exporting the raw material, Albania should be exporting processed ferrochrome, which is an important intermediate product, which is used in stainless steel applications. And one of the largest markets for this product is China. So I think Albania should follow the examples of other countries, other emerging economies that have succeeded in completing this transition from chromium ore to ferrochrome. And these are countries such as Kazakhstan and South Africa, which are also big amongst the top 10 chromium producers in the world. I think this has not happened so far because one of the sort of binding constraints on ferrochrome production is electricity supply. And until recently, there were substantial problems of electricity undersupply in Albania. But now that these problems have been resolved and the electricity supply constraint has been lifted, I think this would be the right time to think about this potential sort of structural upgrading. So the last point that I want to emphasize, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it's always discussed a lot in public discourse in Albania amongst in policy circles as well. So there's a lot of discussion about this. But I'm just going to mention briefly that another sort of challenge or weakness of the Albanian economy that is holding economic growth back is the slow pace of institutional transformation. Yeah. So there's arguably uncertain progress towards democratic change and consolidation. Elections continue to be marred by irregularities or alleged irregularities, and certainly by violence, as the events of summer 2019, when the local elections were held, amply testify. And there's some evidence, I wouldn't say conclusive evidence, but certainly some evidence in the literature that suggests that the quality of democracy is an important driver of economic growth. Yeah. And this is also an important condition for EU accession. So I think progress on this is necessary moving forward, but it has been quite slow in coming up to now. By the same token, I would emphasize that the sort of anti-corruption efforts in recent years have been arguably not very effective. And this is not to say that corruption has not declined. So what I'm showing you here is a diagram that represents a measure for the magnitude and incidence of corruption, which is essentially a a perception-based indicator of the quality of governance from the World Bank. And this is represented by this downward sloping curve. And the upward sloping curve is GDP per capita. So what this diagram suggests is that corruption in Albania essentially has declined at the same time as income per capita has increased. And there is in the literature, in the political economy literature, a lot of evidence that suggests that development actually exerts a causal positive effect on corruption. So essentially that the best anti-corruption tool is economic development. And this is not to say that sort of more deliberate anti-corruption efforts are not necessary. But I think what we could argue perhaps is that in Albania, the bulk of anti-corruption has been done by economic growth more than by anti-corruption, aid-funded anti-corruption programs, or by deliberate efforts by the government to curb graft. So there is still a lot of leeway for essentially more deliberate anti-corruption efforts to play a role in reducing corruption. Corruption being an important drag on economic growth, and there is sort of extensive evidence of this in the literature. And I think the evidence points in this direction also when it comes to Albania. So this diagram charts gives you the relationship between corruption on the horizontal axis in Albania for various years, as measured by the same World Bank produced indicator of the incidence of corruption. And then on the vertical axis, you have economic growth. And this diagram already controls for a number of potential other determinants of economic growth. So after accounting for these other determinants, what we still observe is a negative relationship between economic growth and corruption. So essentially, in the years in which allegedly more corruption took place in Albania, in those years, economic growth was lower. So just a couple of words before I wrap up on the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in 2000, Albania experienced essentially the first economic recession since the 1997 unrest. And even so, the contraction in aggregate output was fairly moderate, at least if we compare the figure with the corresponding figures for advanced Eurozone economies. So the contraction was only 3.5%. And there was a substantial policy response on the part of the state. So the central bank further cut the policy rate to 0.5% from 1%. So this is an unprecedentedly low interest rate in an emerging economy. And also the government launched a substantial fiscal stimulus package worth about 2.8% of GDP, consisting of things like tax deferrals, social transfers, and sovereign loan guarantees. The main, I should add that the main transmission mechanism through which the pandemic has had an impact on the Albanian economy has been the tourism sector, which is the largest service sector industry in Albania, accounting for about 1/5 of aggregate GDP. And obviously that sector was completely dead in the early months of the pandemic. And so the bulk of the sort of COVID-19 effect on the macroeconomy has been channeled by the contraction of tourism revenues. So just to summarize, so I've highlighted some of the strengths or some of the achievements of the Albanian economy in the last 10 plus years. And these include its remarkable macroeconomic and financial stability. I've highlighted the fact that economic growth has been of a particular kind, namely of a kind that has led to job creation and also to poverty reduction. And in particular, I would say on this score, progress has been really spectacular. But there are a number of ongoing weaknesses and hence challenges. So persistently large external imbalances, which could lead to balance of payment problems, and maybe even a balance of payment crisis of the Greek kind in the future. So this is a red flag that should be taken into account by policymakers. The second point that I've highlighted, which I consider to be really of critical importance if Albania is to stave off the what is known as the middle income trap, so the inability of growing economies to kind of graduate past the middle income level and join the club of advanced economies. And that weakness has to do with the fact that the productive and hence the export capabilities of the Albanian economies have changed very little in the last 20 years. And so this has prevented the creation of new comparative advantages. This has prevented Albania from sort of carving for itself a better, more favorable place in the global division of labor. So what Albania should do moving forward is to reinvent its productive economy and think about new sectors, new higher value added activities that could be started in the country. There are also persistent institutional dysfunctions that certainly hold back economic growth and which are also a crucial obstacle to the process of EU accession, because they are often included as explicit conditions for progress on the EU accession path. So ways forward. So I'm just going to end on this. So I think it's very important, as I said, that Albania should, discover new comparative advantages, essentially. So think about what it could be producing 10 years from now, what new sectors could be started in Albania, given its endowments, given its specificities, given its particular talents, that would allow it to move up the global division of labor, so to speak, and capture more benefits from, greater benefits from exports. And I think one encouraging sign is the fact that a new automotive industry has actually given signs of life in Albania in recent years, with 2 foreign companies having started operation for the production of car parts one in Elbasan and the other one I don't remember where, but in central Albania. And certainly, becoming part of the automotive supply chain could be an avenue into that type of productive upgrade that I was discussing earlier. I think Albania should also use the pandemic as an opportunity. I mean, often there's always a lot of inertia in economic systems, in economic processes, and you often need an external shock, like a very aggressive, a very violent break imparted from the outside to change the way things are done. And the pandemic may provide this opportunity. More specifically, one opportunity created by the pandemic is the opportunity that Albania has to capture more foreign investment, essentially as advanced economy embark on reshoring strategies. So multinationals based in advanced economies, maybe now they don't want to have segments of their supply chains located in far-flung countries. They want all the production to take place closer to home. And in this sense, Albania could leverage its favorable geographic location close to the Eurozone to capture more foreign direct investment. Lastly, I think Albania should partly rethink its EU accession strategy and the sort of role played by the EU accession process in the sort of country's overall development strategy. But this is maybe a topic that I can leave for the discussion. So thank you, Arber and Stephen.
Well, thank you very much, Luca. So we're going to move straight on to questions, I think, that's all right. And I was thinking maybe we could start by turning to the ambassador to see whether you like, Ambassador, to say some words, whether it's questions or statements or whatever. We would love to hear from you.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you, Ambassador Nesh, for this great opportunity to have Professor Uberti here and to listen such such a professional presentation and very interesting at the same time. So I have a concrete question, Professor Uberti, that if he will be the economic advisor of the Prime Minister, what would be his suggestion for the Prime Minister for the next 10 years?
Good question. Hmm.
I see that you're not making it easy for me. So I think I would maybe re-emphasize some of the points made earlier, which I think were hinting to some extent in that direction. I think quite concretely, industrializing Albania's minerals should be a fundamental priority. So making sure that, say, 10 years from now, the share of unprocessed mineral ores exported by Albania is actually lower. And correspondingly, the share of processed mineral products, so intermediate products, which are exported by Albania, is proportionally higher. Yeah. And that means investing in existing production capabilities. So as I mentioned, the two chrome smelters that Albania already has in Elbasan and Burel, they're operated by Alb Chrome, which is owned by Alfin Group, and maybe expanding this capacity. And I think really seeing how countries like Kazakhstan and South Africa have managed and implemented this kind of transition could provide critical cues for Albania. I mean, if you look at the sort of, if you study a little bit the chrome sector, you see that countries like Kazakhstan and South Africa, I mean, up until a few years ago, were very much in the same boat as Albania. So they were just raw material exporters. They were just producing chromium ore, and all the processing was taking place elsewhere. Now to China, which is the main market, as I said, they export ferrochrome. So they export the intermediate product, whereas Albania keeps exporting the raw material. So I think this should be a concrete priority for the for mining policy. When it comes to the call center industry, I mean, I think that this industry will no longer exist in the next 10 years from now. I think I think Albania has been fortunate enough that the Italians, don't really know how to use the computer as well as other others in Europe. So there's continuing demand for data entry and telemarketing services in the Italian market, but this will definitely change. As I said, the pandemic is accelerating this pre-existing process of technical change. So I think Albania and its policymakers should think about a restructuring and maybe even an exit strategy for this sector, which also has social implications, because there's, I think, more than 20,000 people employed in the call center industry. Some of the companies in that sector, such as, I think the largest until its recent restructuring was IDS, owned by Agron Shehai, so they were amongst the largest private sector employers in the country. So lots of people get their wages from this sector. When the sector is out, obviously you can have a lot of social unrest if there isn't an exit strategy, and if new forms of employment are created that will absorb this the workers that were previously working in the call center industry. So essentially, a social safety net might also be necessary for the workers, as well as an exit strategy for the entrepreneurs. So in scattered orders, yeah, these are some of the priorities that I could think of.
I think we've got a question from Jej Bakalbashi on construction in the economy. Jej, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, Luca. Thank you for your presentation. And probably you touched on it. I had to join in a bit late. I was wondering what the role of construction industry plays in the economy according to your metrics. And I was sort of intrigued by the paradigm comparison that you made between Albania and South Africa, and I believe another country. I mean, how does the economy of Albania measure to other small countries, let's say in Europe or in the Balkans, in terms of performance and priorities?
Yeah, so let me first answer the construction. So the question about the construction sector. If you give me a minute, I will also give you some data. Okay, sorry, I cannot find the data in this text, but I think the important thing to note about the construction industry is that it is no longer as important as a driver of growth in Albania as it was in the late 2000s, early 2010s, when there was a massive construction boom going on in the country, and the construction sector was at the time a very important driver of growth. Now it's less the case, and that's the result of essentially of policy decisions taken by the government in the direction of slowing down the pace of urban development. So many more regulatory land zoning plans were introduced in the last 5 to 10 years. Now I don't remember the dates exactly, and several moratoriums on construction permits were put in place by the government that obviously had the effect of slowing down the pace of urban development, and hence the dynamism of the construction sector. But this is not bad. I mean, probably the construction industry was oversupplying housing units to the Albanian economy in the early 2010s. So I think these are welcome developments. In terms of, okay, maybe I'll ask for a clarification. Yeah.
Sorry,
yes,
can I just quickly, maybe, I don't mean to interrupt you. My question is that something that shows up in the books, or is that something that you are inferring because of the slowdown in the permitting process? Because according to the mayor of Tirana, the foremost driving engine of creating jobs in Tirana is the construction industry. And according to the numbers, the amount of building permits issued by the city and the government jointly in Tirana exceeds by far what has been issued previously. And again, I may be wrong on this. You have probably you have a clearer picture of the metrics, but is that something that is reported or something that you're inferring because of the, as you said, policy to tighten up on construction permits?
No, I mean, you may well be right.
I happen to sort of be a bit familiar. Yeah.
Yeah. No, you may well be right because the No, I mean, you could be right in the sense that the construction industry is a very labor-intensive industry. So when compared to other sectors, it may be a more important provider of employment than other industries at the moment in Tirana. So that may well be true, but that statement is, I don't think it's inconsistent with the statement that I've made, which is that the slowdown in permitting and the introduction of zoning laws and regulatory plans about 10 years ago, I think, or less than 10 years ago, I think has had an impact on the industry as a whole, and the impact was a slowdown. So relative to the pace of development prior to then, now things move on, move a little bit more slowly. But in terms of employment creation, it may well be true that the construction sector is by far the largest provider of employment in Tirana. I don't know, but it may well be true.
I think we had a hand up from Gabriel Partos and then Gzim. So if we could take them in that turn, in that order.
Sorry, I think Georgi also had another question about how Albania compares to other countries in the region, but if you could make it a little bit more precise. So how Albania compares From what point of view, based on what metric?
I just, when you mentioned the mineral industry,
Yeah.
you referred to something like South Africa, and maybe I misunderstood it, but I just meant in terms of scope. I mean, it seems like South Africa is probably a global player when relative to Albania, and that was my question. You know?
Yeah, no, I see. I mean, both Kazakhstan and South Africa are higher income economy. Yeah, both Kazakhstan and South Africa are higher income economy than Albania, and South Africa is also a more sophisticated economy from a technology point of view. But I mean, Albania may also become, or I mean, it should, I think, aim to become a global player in the chromium industry. I mean, the reason why Kazakhstan and South Africa are global players in this particular sector is not because they decided to be, or because, you know, they woke up one day and said, okay, we want to be global players in chrome, but it's because their geography is such that they are abundant in chromium resources, and Albania is also such that its geography is abundant in chromium resources. So I think it's a natural endowment that should be exploited. And I think my point, and I repeat it because I think it's quite important and really sort of goes to the essence of the point that I was making about upgrading the country's productive capabilities. I think it would be strategically important to see how these two countries planned and implemented the transition from being exporters of raw chrome to being exporters of a more sophisticated and technologically advanced intermediate product, namely ferrochrome. And I think that that historical experience may suggest cues as to how Albania can pull off a similar transition, which would be in the interest of economic growth in Albania.
Okay, thank you.
Can we have you, Gabriel, on?
Yeah, thank you, Luca, for an excellent and very informative presentation. I've got a couple of quick questions. One relating to the challenges. You mentioned the dependence on textiles and footwear, and also telemarketing. Of course, these are overwhelmingly for the Italian market. In terms of textiles, footwear, yeah. I think Italian market takes about 50% of total Albanian exports, or fair enough. I just wonder to what extent that is a danger, potential threat to stability, Albanian economic stability, this over-reliance on one country. The second is looking more at the opportunities. I just wonder to what extent you think that renewables are a big potential plus for Albania in terms of wind energy, solar energy, of course, in addition to the existing and further plans for hydro. Albania, of course, already has a clean energy electricity system, cleanest in Europe, or possibly in the world. So in addition to the hydro potential and existing capacity, I just wonder to what extent you think that's a very important new source for production, economic growth, and of course, in particular, exports.
Yeah. No, on export diversification, I agree with you. So much as reliance on a limited menu of export products is dangerous, because obviously it increases exposure to potential external shocks that could lead to volatility in export revenues. By the same token, also reliance on a limited range of export markets also exposes the country to potential external shocks. And I think you know, the fact that the Italian economy has essentially stagnated for the past 20 years also has had indirectly an impact on the Albanian economy, which is very, very, very deeply integrated with the Italian economy, both from the point of view of trade, but also when it comes to remittances, also when it comes maybe less so to aid and investment. But surely when it comes to trade and remittances, Albania depends massively on the Italian economy. So yeah, this is a weakness, and certainly diversification in terms of the range of export markets targeted by Albania would be a positive development. To some extent, obviously, the deep integration with the Italian economy is, it's just a question of geographical proximity, historical links, and the sheer size of the Italian economy. So, in sort of trade theoretic terms, it's no surprise that Albania is closely integrated with the Italian economy. But in strategic terms, I think diversification would be good. And the other point, I don't know much about renewable energies, so I'm not sure I can comment on or contribute to this. Also because, as you said, I think the important point is that Albania already has a very clean energy mix, and I think this is even more remarkable considering that Albania is a very, very oil-rich country. So we have the second oil richest country in Europe after Norway, having a very, very clean electricity generation system. So it's quite remarkable. I'm not sure what the role of solar power or wind power could be in Albania. I have no clue.
Could we have your question, Zim? And I think after that we've got Andrew Huckle.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Dr. Uberti, for this enlightening talk. I don't know a thing about economics, so I'll try to just give you a couple of thoughts rather than questions. I found the picture that you draw of the Albanian economy quite impressive and quite positive, to be frank with you, which shows what an ignorant I am. But I wonder if you have any figures as to how many people are currently employed in Albania and what the level of unemployment is there. And the other thing is, when you get the data, are they from independent agencies or from government institutions, so that we have, if you like, reliable data? And the other thing is, I wonder if in your research, you and your team tackle on the issue of the institutionalized corruption in Albania, which I believe is a major impediment for the development of the country.
Yeah, so on employment, yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I think we can have another look at this data together. So in 2020, the unemployment rate was about almost 12%, which is just a couple of percentage points higher than the unemployment rate in Italy. This is lower than the unemployment rate in Greece. And, so it's quite low. And also looking at the historical series, it's interesting. I think it's quite telling to see that actually over the years, unemployment in Albania has been consistently lower than in comparable economies in the Western Balkan region. You wanted to know how many people, how many units, how many individuals are employed. Was that your question?
Yeah.
Well, I don't have the figure here, but so 11% are unemployed out of the total labor force. So the population is 2.8, 2.9 million. The labor force participation rate is about 60%. So you have to do 60% of 2.8 million, and then 87%, 88% of that. Do we want to compute it? We can do it if you'd like. So 2.8 million times 60%, that's the labor force roughly, and then 87%. There should be 1.4 million people are in regular employment in the formal economy.
Right. In the formal economy?
In the formal economy. Then obviously there's the informal economy, which is not taken into account in any of these figures presented in this presentation.
And I think this raises the point that Elvisa was writing about. It was quite a long one. I wonder, actually, Andrew, if you wouldn't mind just holding off your question while we bring Elvisa in. I don't know if you're ready, but you've got your hand up.
Hello, sorry. I wrote it because I thought the questions will be sent in written form. But you mentioned the job growth as a very key strength of the Albanian economy. Actually, it's more a consequence of the formalization campaigns. So the jobs were there, but they were just brought into formal arrangements. So and then because those were previously informal jobs, when they became formal, the formalization reduced the wages, and then you have this chain of insecure jobs and a lot of complaining about the living wages and living standards. So in the living standard measuring survey, you will see that over 50% of the working population, they do complain about job insecurity, and this is both in the public sector and private sector. So I don't know if it's a key strong point of the Albanian economy. The growth was associated with job creation, but that was only in terms of quantitatively, not qualitatively. These are bad jobs or precarious jobs. And then you will see a lot of people, especially now the middle class, who have had previously saved jobs, or they thought they will not leave the country. Now you see increasing trends in terms of migration intentions. So the growth is there, yes. The job creation, I'm not sure. They were informal jobs, they were brought into formalization. And I don't know, you can measure growth, but I don't know if you can measure the subjective or dividend of the growth, or the happiness, or the quality of jobs, and inequality, and all these other aspects. So the numbers are there, but there is quite a lot of hidden dynamics, especially with the formal and informal economies. So I don't know if
I think these are very important points, and that's certainly sort of the underside of the story, which I didn't mention, that there are lots of jobs, but they are low quality jobs. And I think an important driver of migration, as you hinted, is the fact that there's a dearth of high quality professional jobs, and now there's lots of highly educated people in Albania, as I discussed. So there's a mismatch between the supply of highly educated people and the demand for those people. And
even in the employment, you will see that it's dominated by low skills employees. So the highest share of the high skill employees, or people who actually leave the university, they don't find a place, because these are jobs basically in agriculture and in tourism, which are seasonally based sectors, and also the national development strategy, which promotes them. But
agreed. And also what you say about the substitution effect, let's say, from informal to formal jobs as a result of the formalization campaigns, I mean, it could have played a role. But still, what we see is that even in the early 2010s, for instance, when surely this is maybe before the more recent formalization policy efforts by the government, still unemployment in Albania was the lowest in the Western Balkan region. And the point that I wanted to make, I mean, with all the sort of very important qualifications that you raise, is that it's the growth model of Albania and its reliance on labor-intensive industries, which leads to this macroeconomic feature, which is positive. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, there is also then, the other side of the coin is that these sectors like call centers and façon, textiles and leather and footwear and so on, which are highly labor-intensive, which have allowed the economy to mobilize the population into the labor force, are not very dynamic sector from a technological point of view. So they're not very sort of, they're not a promising basis on which to chart a development strategy. But in the short term, one positive aspect of that is that they've been able to they allowed Albania to mobilize the population into the labor force.
Could I just follow up on the issue of institutionalized corruption, Dr. Uberti?
Yes, yes.
How
yes,
serious
yes.
a problem do you think that is? And what are the long and short-term and long-term consequences of Albania's accession to the EU?
What are the consequences of institutionalized corruption for the accession process, or what are the consequences of the accession process?
Of the accession process.
Of the accession process. I mean, on corruption, I think it's a very serious issue, as it is for, I think, most developing and emerging and transition economies, and indeed for many advanced economies as well. And I think the evidence in the literature is quite strong in suggesting that the presence of corruption has a slowing effect on economic growth. I think there's sort of very strong causal evidence to this effect. But another piece of evidence that is not emphasized as much, but which can be found in very, very robustly in the literature, is that there is also a reverse effect from economic development to corruption reduction. So historically, a lot of corruption reduction has taken place because countries have developed. You know? So it's a two-way causal process. I mean, the effect runs both from corruption to economic development and from economic development to corruption. So I think, you know, there are some fundamentalists, or maybe I consider them fundamentalists, that say that, you know, the binding constraint, the absolutely, you know, sort of the main precondition for development in Albania is elimination of corruption. You know, there I don't agree, because there's lots of other things as well, and priorities have to be balanced. And certainly we need to fight corruption, but a lot of corruption will be fought by social forces. So not by government programs, not by aid donors, but by social forces naturally as the economy develops. So I think we should attack corruption on two fronts, both directly, like say the UNDP does, and also indirectly by doing, you know, by embarking on other economic development strategies that have the effect of promoting economic growth, raising the levels of income, and thereby reduce corruption. And I think that this is what we've seen in Albania in the last 20 years. I mean, a lot of this corruption reduction, and corruption has gone down a lot in Albania in the last 20 years. But I think all of that is due to economic development. Or most of that is due to economic development. I mean, and this is my, you know, I don't have, actually, I've done some regression analysis on this, but, you know, it's far from conclusive. The role played by explicit, deliberate anti-corruption efforts has been, you know, at best secondary. So yes, we should continue to fight corruption, I think, but there's also other priorities, and I don't think we should think of corruption as the overwhelming priority for Albania. There's also other things as well. This is my opinion.
Thank you.
Could we have a question from Andrew Huckle, please?
Sorry, yeah, and then there was a point on the EU accession, but maybe we can link it to other questions, Arber, if they come up.
Yeah, we can do. I mean, we could deal with that, unless, Andrew, your question is about that, happens to be about that, which I might.
It's not, but I'm happy to wait. That's fine.
All right, then, Luca, if you could.
I suspect that something about EU accession will come up. So how about we take Andrew's question and then.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds like you planted a question about EU accession, Luca.
Best for last.
Luca, thank you for such a great presentation. I just wanted to briefly ask about the demographic challenges in Albania. You know, of course, I know this is perhaps more longer term, but around its population being projected to fall and its society becoming more older, and just your thoughts on that. And also, if it'd be possible to share the slides after this meeting, I found them really useful. Thank you.
Yeah, I will share the slides to Arber, and then I'm happy for the material to be circulated. Yeah, so I mean, as we all know, both the rate of population growth and fertility rates have declined dramatically in Albania, and the rate of population growth has gone into negative territory. partly because of the fall in fertility after the fall of the communist regime, but primarily because of out-migration. And I mean, the sheer scale of migration in Albania has been spectacular. I mean, Albania is quite a unique example of a country that has lost so much of its population as a result of out-migration. And I think that the stock of migrants that Albania has abroad is equivalent to about 50 or to more than 50% of the resident population of Albania. This is quite unique. So that's why Albania has been such a laboratory for migration economists. What the consequences could be, I mean, okay, I don't have a sort of pre-packaged argument on this, but certainly, as I said during the talk, out-migration has helped relieve pressure on the Albanian economy, essentially removing surplus labor from the country that could have caused various types of political and social unrest had it not been absorbed by labor markets in foreign countries. And again, the geographic proximity of Albania to very rich economies in the Eurozone and to Italy has been a massive advantage in this sense, because take Albania, move it in the middle of the Pacific, the history would have, holding everything else constant, but history would have been very, 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 very different. Obviously, there's a problem of brain drain. I'm not an expert of migration economics, but I think this is an important issue, and there is potential for Albania to tap into its diaspora, both in terms of the potential of tapping into return migrants for business development, for instance, and also the potential, for instance, of absorbing remittances and channeling remittances into productive investment rather than just in consumption. And this is, I've never heard much discussion about this in Albania, but I've heard a bit of discussion about this in Kosovo when I was consulting. It was a NEO project, and I was dispatched to the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Pristina, advising on trade and industrial policy. And I remember there, in that particular project, there was discussion about potential ways, potential mechanisms to channel diaspora savings into productive investment, which could be maybe, it could take the form of a development bank. There is discussion in Kosovo about establishing a development bank. Never heard of any discussion along these lines in Albania. Or it could be, a government bond, a financial instrument issued by the government that is specifically targeted at the diaspora, which could incentivize it. It could be marketed in such a way that it would incentivize Albanian working in Italy, in Greece, in Germany, and so on, not to send the money, not to wire the money home to their households, not to take it, not to put the cash in the bag, get on the plane and take it back home informally, but to buy these bonds, so invest in productive projects. I think this is something important that should be discussed. As I said, it has been discussed to some extent in Kosovo, and I think a similar debate in Albania would be timely. I'm not sure if that answered the question, Andrew.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Yes. Could I ask a question before we wrap up?
Sure.
You mentioned just now that Albania was a laboratory for migration economies. Could you just describe that in greater detail? Because it's an interesting idea, and I'd just like to hear.
Yeah. So yeah, on a more academic note, as I said, I'm not a migration economist. Here at the University of Luxembourg, there's a big research cluster on migration, so I'm becoming more exposed now to this literature and to these research topics. But if you look at the academic literature in economics on Albania, I would say that 90% of the work that is published has to do with migration. I mean, that's all I wanted to say, simply because the migration experience has featured so prominently in the recent history, economic, and also social history of Albania. So, and since the scale of migration has been so substantial, obviously this has provided an opportunity to study a number of phenomena that could not be readily observed in other contexts. That's what I wanted to say, but actually, there's a lot of literature on this. So for instance, there's this, just very, very quickly, this is quite academic. There's a paper that investigates the impact of Albanian of remittances on the distribution of labor in the household between wife and husband in Albania. There's a paper that explores the impact of Albanian migrants' remittances on education expenditure by the households left behind. There's a paper that investigates the impact of return migration on business development. There's a paper that explores the impact of return migration on occupational mobility, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a very, very rich literature on Albanian migration in economics.
Well, unless we've got something very pressing in the pipeline, I think now perhaps is the time to draw a conclusion. This has been a fascinating exchange. Well, firstly, your presentation, which was and clear, as well as be broad brush. So it was a very good combination. And I would also thank the audience as well. I think we've had a very good audience and some good questions. And I think we've all gone away with a great what's going on in the Albanian economy. And I certainly feel we've learned a lot. So very many thanks, Luca. I think we should try to clap you. I think there are ways, are there not? Where is the clap module here? But anyway, I will clap.
Thank you, thanks.
Yes, yes. Very good evening, I enjoyed it. And I think we all did.
Thank you very much again for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be here with you.